Jinnah House Lahore.
Jinnah House Lahore.
Jinnah House.
Jinnah House.
Jinnah House Lahore.
Janaah.
Shortly after 2 o'clock on 9th May 2023, former Prime Minister Imran Khan was arrested from the premises of the Islamabad High Court, sparking immediate protests across the country. By 3 p.m. in the city of Lahore, large crowds of protesters gathered near Imran Khan's Zaman Park residence and Liberty Chowk. As the day progressed, some of the protesters entered the Lahore Cantonment and surrounded the Corps Commander House in order to express their outrage towards the institution perceived to be responsible for the arrest of their leader. Soon after, videos began to emerge on social media of protesters inside the Corps Commander House, upturning furniture, stealing peacocks, raiding the fridges and setting fire to portions of the building. Thousands were arrested or detained on terrorism charges, most of whom had never even been inside the Corps Commander House and had nothing to do with vandalism or arson of any kind. Those arrested included prominent PTI leaders such as Yasmin Rashid and Shah Mahmood Qureshi, as well as ordinary PTI supporters such as Pakistani-American fashion designer Khadija Shah, who was farcically charged with masterminding the attacks. In addition, military courts were set up to try those responsible for what was branded as an attempt to overthrow the military leadership and spark a mutiny within the army. To this day, although few convictions have been made, many of those charged with involvement in what became known as the May 9 tragedy continue to be held in prison or military custody. Curiously, as the crackdown against PTI was taking place, Bungalow 53, universally known as the Corps Commander House Lahore, was rebranded as Jinnah House. Extensive media coverage portrayed the home as an invaluable part of Pakistan's national cultural heritage, and the attack on the property as an assault on the very essence of Pakistan, as well as its founder, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah. While this ubiquitous use of the term Jinnah House may lead one to think that the property was intimately connected to Pakistan's founding father, the truth is much more complicated. Soch explains the history of Jinnah House Lahore. So what was Muhammad Ali Jinnah's connection to Bungalow 53 anyway? To answer this question and learn more about Jinnah's connection to the property, Soch carried out an extensive review of Jinnah's correspondence as collected together in the Jinnah Papers, an 18-volume compilation of the Qaid's correspondence from 1940 to 1947. We also visited the National Archives in Islamabad to look through original documents preserved in the Quaid-e-Azam papers. What we found was a fascinating and revealing correspondence between Jinnah and various officers of the colonial government and the British Indian Army regarding Bungalow 53 Lahore Cantonment. Now, before we continue, let's get some context. According to extracts from the General Land Register of the Lahore Cantonment Board, Jinnah purchased Bungalow 53 in Lahore Cantonment from Mohanlal Bhashan for the sum of Rs 162,000 on October 12, 1943. Jinnah had been looking to establish a base for himself in the politically important city of Lahore, the historic capital of the largest Muslim-majority province in India. However, in January 1944, just shortly before the property was purchased, it was requisitioned under D1 rules by the Deputy Commissioner Lahore to be used as officer accommodation. Jinnah was understandably upset by his property being forcibly taken over by the colonial authorities. Starting in October 1946, he wrote a series of letters to the colonial authorities demanding the return of his property. The next bit of correspondence that we found in the archives is a letter dated 13 January 1947, written by a Major Khanna, garrison engineer of the Lahore Cantonment, informing Jinnah that he would not be able to vacate Jinnah's property for his use, owing to the severe shortage of accommodation for army officers. Major Khanna then followed up his letter on the 5th of February with an official notice for requisition of Bungalow 53. And that is why, on February 10, 1947, Jinnah wrote back to Major Khanna demanding that the army return his property in the interest of fairness and justice, and expressing his outrage that the army had effectively decided to expropriate his property. 3 days later, on 13 February, Jinnah wrote again acknowledging receipt of Major Khanna's official notice sent on 5 February and asking for clarification on the particular clause the Major had cited to justify the army's expropriation of his bungalow, which Jinnah believed to be incorrect. More than a month passed before, on 20th March 1947, Major Khanna wrote to Jinnah acknowledging receipt of his 2 letters and informing him that they had been passed to the commander for Lahore sub-area and that he would be writing directly to Jinnah from now on. Separately, Major Khanna also acknowledged that he had been mistaken about the lease agreement and that it was in fact Clause 3 and not Clause 6 that provided for the Cantonment Board to commandeer Jinnah's property. On 2 April 1947, R.A. Harris, colonel to the commander for the Lahore sub-area, sent a letter to Jinnah explaining that the British Indian Army maintained a lien on the use of all properties built in the cantonment. Referring to the Cantonment Act 1923 and the Defence of India rules, Colonel Harris explained that an indefinite requisition order had been in effect with regards to Jinnah's property since 22 January 1944. Harris further explained that even if this statutory power was revoked by the Government of India, he would then rely on Clause 3 of Schedule 7 of the lease agreement to appropriate the property. The next day, on 3rd April, Jinnah wrote to Major Khanna asking for a reply regarding his request to know the specifics of the clause allowing the army to appropriate his property, as well as the date of the lease agreement and expiry period of the requisition. Expressing his frustration at the way he had been dealt with so far, Jinnah asked for a frank response so that he could decide how to proceed with this matter. On 11th April 1947, Colonel Harris again wrote to Jinnah acknowledging his 3rd April letter to Major Khanna and apologizing for the delay in providing clarity regarding the Army's legal position regarding his property. Harris reiterated that the requisitioning order was for an indefinite period and that the cantonment reserved the authority to appropriate any property within its bounds under Clause 3 of Schedule 7 of the Cantonments Act 1923 as outlined in the lease agreement to which Jinnah acceded when he purchased the property. While infuriated, instead of responding straight away, Jinnah decided to change tactics and write to Sayyid Wajid Ali, a Muslim leaguer and army contractor based in Lahore, authorizing him to speak on Jinnah's behalf directly with the brigadier commander for Lahore sub-area to explain Jinnah's point of view and seek a favourable resolution. Jinnah also made clear in his letter that this would be his last attempt at an amicable resolution, failing which, he was prepared to take the army to court. By the way, the Sayyid Wajid Ali that Jinnah was corresponding with was the elder brother of Sayyid Babar Ali, the owner of Packages Group and founder of Lums. On 25th April 1947, Jinnah wrote to the Brigadier Commander Lahore sub-area explaining that he had refrained from replying to the 11th April letter sent by Colonel Harris in light of Sayyid Wajid Ali's meeting with Colonel Harris, in which he had assured Sayyid Wajid Ali that the matter of returning Jinnah's property would be carefully considered by the commander. Jinnah explained that due to the political developments taking place, he would need to be in Lahore for a considerable period of time, and that he bought the property in the hopes that it would be returned back to him once the Second World War had ended. Colonel Harris wrote back to Jinnah on 1st May 1947, acknowledging receipt of his 25th April letter and notifying him that the sub-area commander had determined that it would not be possible to return Jinnah's property to him. He again explained that this was because of the acute shortage of accommodation for married officers in the Lahore Cantonment, especially following the nationalisation of the Officer Corps Commander of the Indian Armed Forces. Colonel Harris highlighted that 90 married officers were currently awaiting accommodation, the bulk of whom were Indian. Further, he said that the army would have acceded to Jinnah's request if it did not have to prioritise its own needs, an interesting stance to take with respect to someone else's property. Sayyid Wajid Ali duly wrote to Jinnah on May 5th to apologise for the sub-commander's refusal to take up his request of returning Jinnah's property. He noted that the district commander, General Bruce, had been posted to Rawalpindi, making it impossible for his father, Sayyid Muratib Ali, to take the case up with him, while at the same time the Quartermaster General for India, General Wood, who was ultimately in charge of property requisitions, was away in England for a month. Sayyid Wajid advised Jinnah to wait until General Wood's return, after which, if the matter was still unresolved, he could take up the matter in court. However, political events soon intervened to make such a legal battle unnecessary. On June 3, 1947, the last Viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten, announced that British India would be partitioned along religious lines.
The solution to this dilemma, which I put forward, is that His Majesty's government should transfer power now to one or two governments of British India, each having dominion status, as soon as the necessary arrangements can be made.
As such, it became clear that Lahore would fall inside a new state of Pakistan and that the army officers who had been denying Jinnah his rights were sooner or later going to end up reporting to him. To avoid such embarrassment, on 4th July 1947, Jinnah was informed that General Headquarters India had issued an order to de-requisition his property as an act of grace and returned it to him by 31st August 1947. For his part, Jinnah insisted that the property be returned to its original state with no damage and all the fittings restored. The final letter to refer to this matter in the Jinnah papers is dated 26 August 1947, with Jinnah asking Sayyid Wajid Ali for updates regarding his Lahore house. Finally, in January 1948, the army returned the property to Jinnah. But Jinnah, occupied as he was with state affairs and struggling health, would never end up residing in Jinnah House, despite all the energy he expended in getting it back from the colonial administration. In fact, from the 31st of January 1948, when Sayyid Maratib Ali took possession of the house on his behalf, to his death on September 11th of that year, by all accounts, he never spent a night there, instead staying at the Davis Road residence of Nawab Iftikhar Hussain Mamdot whenever he was in Lahore. It's worth mentioning that compared to the other Jinnah houses, the one in Lahore has a remarkably tenuous connection with Jinnah himself. While Jinnah's purchase of Quaid-e-Azam house in Karachi foreshadowed his return to the city of his birth, his home in New Delhi was where he lived while engaged in his political struggle, and his beloved Bombay mansion was where he spent perhaps the longest part of his adult life. In contrast, neither Jinnah nor any of his sisters ever lived in Bungalow 53, Lahore Cantonment. But what's important to remember is that the reason why the connection is so tenuous is because of the military authorities who usurped the property from the Qaid at the height of his political struggle, engaging him in a lengthy and disingenuous bureaucratic exchange while they justified their occupation. What's more, after his life of work for the nation was done, they once again took over the property from his family. On 18 February 1950, less than 2 years after Jinnah was returned control of his property, Pakistan's Ministry of Defense requisitioned the property again. This time, it was to serve as the official residence for the General Officer Commanding of the 10th Division of the Pakistan Army, a precursor to the position now known as Corps Commander Lahore. The Army finally purchased the property from Fatma Jinnah on 11th May 1959. Thus, the property gained recognition not through any association with the Quaid-e-Azam, which was unknown to the public, but through the Pakistan military's continuous occupation and use of the property, which came to be known in Lahore mostly as a Corps Commander House. In fact, it was only in 1976 when a plaque was erected on the property to honor Jinnah nearly 10 years after its designation as the Corps Commander's residence. In 2007, news reports suggest that there was even some controversy generated by revelations made by the Federal Board of Revenue that the Corps Commander House in Lahore was once owned by the Quaid-e-Azam. This prompted the military to respond to criticism that they were improperly occupying the property by reaffirming that they had legally bought the property from Fatma Jinnah in 1959. If anything, this shows that the public knowledge of the history of Jinnah House Lahore was rather limited until quite recently. If you asked Lahoris where Jinnah House was before 9th May 2023, they wouldn't have the slightest clue. In fact, the use of the term Jinnah House really only began on the night of 9th May 2023, once the property was already in flames. The immediate switch in terminology can be seen via time-restricted searches on Twitter and across social media coverage before and after May 9. Whereas most references to Bungalow 53 before May 9 call it the Corps Commander House, the name of the property suddenly changes to Jinnah House, and since then has been referred to as Jinnah House almost exclusively. On 20th May, the ISPR released an official statement regarding the attack on the property, which they were now also calling Jinnah House. It is ironic that the same institution that appropriated Jinnah's property and subsequently sought to obscure the connection between Jinnah and the property went to such lengths to emphasize that the property belonged to Jinnah and claimed that Jinnah's belongings were damaged in the arson. By calling it Jinnah House instead of the Corps Commander House, the attack on the property was transformed from an action of defiance against the military establishment to an attack on the very foundations of Pakistan itself. We may never know what really happened on 9th May 2023. Was it a mutiny, a false flag operation, or a protest that got out of hand? The fact that mostly unarmed protesters were able to breach what was supposed to be a heavily guarded military installation has certainly led to rampant speculation of an inside job. The absence of an independent commission probing the matter has made resolving conflicting narratives from PTI and the ISPR all the more difficult to resolve. Whatever the case, there is no doubt that the use of the term Jinnah House for the Corps Commander residence has been an integral part of the strategy used by the military establishment to paint those who protested against Imran Khan's illegal arrest as traitors to the country, rather than as opponents of the military's unconstitutional intervention in the country's politics. On the other hand, the speed with which the Pakistan Army moved to possess Jinnah's property and exploit his name sadly mirrors their commandeering of Jinnah's vision for a Pakistan based on democracy and the rule of law.
You can fool all the people some of the time, some of the people all the times, but you cannot fool all the people all the times.